From Fox 8 Sports, this is the Overtime Podcast.
From the Fox 8 studios in New Orleans, this is the Fox 8 Overtime Podcast. I am your host, Sean Fazende, riding shotgun, my co-pilot, the well-dressed Andre Johnson Jr. today. Looks like a guy's about to go on air.
Suited and booted.
I like it. I like a guy with, the suit game going. I like to have my game day drip going as well. You can see that on my Instagram page at the Saints games that I cover day in or weekend and week out. And Andre, we are coming to you on this Thursday, and it's a interesting day because the off-season is here, but the off-season work continues, and that's when the Saints salary cap department sort of comes to the forefront of the news of the New Orleans Saints.
Right. I like to call it salary cap gymnastics that the Saints started today, and that's going to be our big picture topic. Erik McCoy was the first restructure. We know the Saints right now are somewhere in the neighborhood of $80 million over the cap. They've got to clear that by next month. So today, Erik McCoy converted a large portion of his base salary, which is $9.6 million, and his entire roster bonus into signing bonuses. So that saved the Saints about $7.18 million. That would still put them in the range of somewhere between 65 to maybe 70-ish million over the cap, Sean. But still, this is a big win for them.
Well, first and foremost, gentlemen, start your engines because this is the Saints shedding of the salary cap. That season has officially begun. Erik McCoy is number one of at least 7 or 8 or 9 or maybe even 10 guys are going to have some kind of contract adjustment / restructure. We're going to name some of those guys off in just a few minutes. But of all of the players that will be restructured, Erik McCoy was the least risky of all of them because he's only 28 years old, still well into the prime of his career. It's a pretty classic restructure where you take a portion of the base salary, convert it to a signing bonus. I didn't even realize the roster bonus was kind of was thrown in there as well. So they spread it out over the life of the contract, and they create $7.1 million in cap space. It deducts the cap liability down by 7.1. Actually, when I did my initial calculations, because Erik McCoy was easily the most obvious candidate for a restructure, I had him kind of penciled in for about $6 or $6.5 million. So actually, they did this, got a little bit more space than I was anticipating. That's certainly a good sign for the Saints to get, to start this thing. They're well versed in this methodology of salary cap overages and then deductions at getting cap compliant. But Erik McCoy, when you have a guy that has a higher base salary in the prime of his career, those are the guys that are the prime candidates for that restructure, and that's how we're gonna. And that's why. And he's a guy that's very steady, very reliable, and you can see him around here for a few more years. And like I said before, when you do this restructure, it makes it harder to get rid of guys on the back end of their contract. But when you're in your prime of your career, you're still kind of in a good spot with that player. But as we'll get to in a second, not all players fit that mold because some of these guys are going to have to restructure again, are going to be in the latter parts of their career. But first off, your thoughts on the McCoy deal?
I think it was a good start. Like you said, rev your engines because we are going to see a lot of these go down. And the Saints do this every year. So if anything, that should be a reassurance to the fan base that it started, the salary cap gymnastics. Every year the Saints find themselves dozens of millions of dollars over the cap. They're always at the bottom of that list, but somehow they fight their way out of it, and they put themselves in the position to have a pretty good roster on opening day. And Sean, you mentioned some of the other names. I'm curious to see who's next. I look at the list of potential salary cap hits, and at the top is a guy we talked about a couple weeks ago, quarterback Derek Carr. As of right now, he has a $35.7 million cap hit.
And he's got $30 million base salary. And I know he's an older player in regards to the age of the roster, but at 32 going on 33, he's not terribly old for a quarterback. So, and I told you guys when this was happening, in fact, I think it was Luke Johnson was the one that reported it, that this was an obvious one. I know there was some, well, should they, shouldn't they, because if they restructure him, it almost guarantees him a third year with Derek Carr. But the way that contract was set up a $30 million base salary. The Saints hardly ever, especially now with the overages that they have, keep a high base salary on their books. They're almost always converted to a signing bonus and get that cap space. So I fully expect Derek Carr to restructure. That would probably net the Saints about $24 million if you can, knock that off the top of the debt.
A third right there.
That was where the big chunk was always going to come from. And if you didn't do that, or if you don't do that, if you somehow the Saints choose to bypass that, you're basically going to have to restructure the entire roster. And you're already having to do a lot even with that.
Yeah, because when you look at the top 12 cap hits on the Saints books, we talked about Carr at 35.7. Number 2, Ryan Ramczyk. He has a $27 million. Cam Jordan, $23.3 million. Alvin Kamara, $18.7 million. Demario Davis, $18.1. Taysom Hill, right under 16. Marcus Lattimore, about $14.6. Andres Pete, a guy who we talked about earlier, he's about to be a free agent. So he's not really, but he was making $13.6 million. Carl Granderson, $12.4 million. Mike Thomas, who we are almost certain won't be on the roster next year, but regardless, as of right now, it's a $12.4 million cap hit. Honey Badger, $12 million. Cesar Ruiz, almost $11 million. So like you said, if you're trying to cut down from $80 million and you don't take the $24 million that you can get from restructuring Derek Carr, of the 12 people I named, you'd probably have to restructure almost all of them.
And look, even with taking the $24 million, you still have a lot of work to do. But to imagine not taking the $24 million. But you mentioned Carl Granderson. I think that's the next. I don't know if it's the next chronologically, but that's the next most logical one because he's another guy, relatively young, relatively in the prime of his career. But this is a different kind of conversion. He's got a roster bonus due, a high roster bonus, would likely get converted into a signing bonus. Same math applies. Net you probably about $7 million. Cesar Ruiz has another one like that. Not the Erik McCoy way. The roster bonus conversion way from roster bonus to signing bonus. Ruiz could probably get you in the neighborhood of $6 or $7 million. And look, we said it on our Wednesday pod. Cam Jordan, despite his age, is going to have some kind of adjustment to his salary, some kind of restructuring. It's likely going to be a bonus conversion because he has another one of those big roster bonuses that could be flipped to signing bonus, and then you spread it out. This is what they do. This is why it's in these contracts. They almost put it there to give themselves the option to get out because they have always been, when the season ends, the number one team in terms of being over the cap, and yet they always get cap compliant. This is how. It's foresight, but it's also what you have to do after the fact to reevaluate where you currently stand with certain players. You mentioned Ramczyk. That's an interesting name because he's got, I believe, a $17 million base salary. Again, that's a high base salary.
Yep.
One of two things are happening with Ramczyk. Either they're restructuring the way McCoy did it, where you chop it down and spread it out, convert it to a signing bonus and spread it out, or the knee is not there and he retires and they deduct and he voluntarily, they do this with the retired guys where they basically just lower their base salary because they're retiring anyway. They're not getting the money anyway, just to help for the salary cap purposes. One of two things are going to happen with him. So there's an adjustment coming with Ryan Ramczyk, Derek Carr, Erik McCoy, Ruiz, Granderson. Then there's this little category of bubble guys where you can see it if you need the space, but it's also a little risky. You're talking about Kamara.
Yep.
Taysom Hill, who's 33 or 34 years old. Tyrann Mathieu is another name. He's 32, 30. He's got a $7 million base salary. Do you want to restructure that and put yourself on the hook for more money when he's older? Demario Davis is another name that could pop up as well. So a lot of names to consider. And like I said before, the Saints have only just begun with the Erik McCoy restructure.
Right. And my question for you is, for the person who doesn't really, most people don't really understand everything that goes into these salary caps and all the numbers. It can almost make your head spin.
Yes.
The Saints being able to consistently restructure like this, is this kind of like a double-edged sword that can bite them as the years go on?
Yes, because and this is probably the first year where it's really come up to where, okay, this is really the downside of their approach because There is no obvious, this guy's old, he's past his prime, let's cut him and take the small cap hit that we would take, but get all that salary cap space of what would be left after you paid off all that dead money. The problem is when you've restructured these guys so many times, when you would normally want to say goodbye to them, the savings you would get it doesn't make any sense, and you kind of get stuck in this rut of consistently having to restructure these guys well past their 30s. And honestly, what happened last year, and Dennis Allen alluded to it, we talked about it on this pod yesterday, they got old in certain spots. That's the risk you run when you do it this way. And I thought this was the first year that approach manifested itself on the field, where the risk of it, you saw it kind of play out with the roster on the football field.
Right, because, again, something we talked about yesterday, in snap-adjusted age on the rosters in the NFL, the Saints at 28.5 years, they are the oldest team in the NFL. And you see it with guys that you mentioned, the Cams, the DeMarios, the Honey Badgers, guys that Dennis Allen the other day said can still play winnable football, but they're guys that you also are kind of, in a way, stuck with because of a lot of the salary cap gymnastics that you've been doing over the past few years.
And honestly, the way you offset that is, as you're doing this, and look, some of this is not completely there. Some of it is their approach, but some of it they got when you can't. It was hard to project for a COVID year, and that really set them back. And it kind of set them back a little bit further than they wanted to go, and they were trying to get out of that COVID sort of situation. But one of the ways you're able to offset this, high liability salary with these older players, is at some point the infusion of youth that comes in via the draft is able to take off, kind of fill in the gap, so to speak, and they're playing on a cheaper contract. The problem is, I'm not sure enough of those guys have really come to fruition that they've drafted over the last 5 or 6 years that could have, potentially filled in some of those gaps where you feel somewhat okay about where you're at in your roster.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about positions that are kind of being taken over by young players, I think wide receiver on this team, I think cornerback on this team. But outside of wide receiver and cornerback, I mean, most of those young guys just aren't ready to play at a consistent level yet. We saw Brzee on the defensive line, but Foskey and Peyton Turner, Tano Passanio, they haven't been able to work their way into consistent playing time. Pete Werner, Zach Bond on the linebacking core, but nobody's able to replicate what DeMario can do. Adebo, Alante, and Yadam, they've done well in the secondary. Then you look on the offensive line is kind of a jumbled mix. Running back, AK's been running strong for 6 seasons now, but you've got Kendre Miller behind them. It'll be interesting to see how that works. Tight end, your tight end room's kind of, we'll say it's a veteran tight end room. So, I mean, it comes back down to ultimately drafting and being able to get young guys in a position to where you can have a top-tier contributor on that rookie contract.
That's it. I mean, look, other than Pete Werner and Paulson and Debo on the rookie deals right now, I guess Brzee is a decent contributor. McCoy's on his second contract. Ruiz just got paid last year, so we'll give them credit for they've at least developed into starting players. That's 4 guys that I can think of, and only 2 of them are on their rookie contract. That's Werner and Adebo that are steady guys. We'll see what happens with Brian Brzee. I might be missing 1 or 2 off the top of my head. Or Chris Olave is another one, obviously, at the wide receiver position, and you're getting more for your money with Rashid Shaheed. So and Alante Taylor. So what is that, about 5 or 6?
Yep, most playing
maybe
wide
you
receiver
just need
corner.
So the variance may not be too crazy off, but you'd like to get just a little bit more of those younger guys on that rookie deal to help with some of the emergence, or to help with some of these, so where you feel a little bit better about where you're at from a financial commitment standpoint. Speaking of that, though, there was a report. We're going with the projection right now. The Saints were $83 million over before the deduction of Erik McCoy's salary cap number. So I'll call it 75, 74, whatever you want to call it. But there was a report that perhaps that salary cap could be a little bit higher.
Right. It reportedly has been announced that the salary cap could actually be $250 million
instead of
$240 million, which, do the math, if the Saints are, say, around that $70 million over the cap, if that salary cap is actually $250 million, that brings you down to 60. Still a lot to be over the cap, but Sean, that saves you at least 1 or 2 restructures.
Look, the significance of $250 million versus 240 or 242, whatever the projection was at the initial reading, would be huge. And if I'm the Saints, I am praying for this to be the reality of the situation. Now, who reported that? Was that a Mike Florio report?
I believe so.
Okay. The Mike Florio has a tendency to report things as some believe the salary cap might be. I don't know how you can get away with that. I guess if you own your own site, you can be. But look, for the purpose of this podcast, let's be glass half full and say that could be the reality for the Saints. And if that is the case, thank goodness that's one less restructure, maybe 2 less restructures. That's one less difficult conversation you got to have. That's one less risk you have to run. Like I said, we've already articulated the risk of this sort of way of doing business, but you kind of get stuck having to do it when the bill comes due and you have to figure out ways to get under the threshold there. So if it's at 250, the Saints are probably the happiest organization in the NFL. If it's at 242, they got to do probably the 8 or 9 or 9 or 10 restructures in salary conversions and bonus conversions that we've been talking about. So if you're a Saints fan, hope and pray it's at 250 because that's one less difficult decision this organization would have to make.
Absolutely. We talked about all the names, all the cap hits, and even if it's 242, or 250 from 242, an extra $8 million can go a long way.
Oh, no doubt, especially with the way the Saints are able to to finagle $8 million with the different ways they can do things with that $8 million difference. And remember this, they don't just have to get cap compliant, they have to get far enough down to A, sign their draft class, B, they're gonna sign some form of free agent from another roster. It's not just gonna be veteran minimum deals around the NFL. They're gonna bring some people aboard from other rosters. You got a brand new offensive coordinator who probably wants some of his guys or people he knows or people he believes is gonna fit via the free agent route. That's just the nature of the NFL. So it's not just getting cap compliant. It's getting cap compliant far enough so you can also make some moves.
Right. So not only do you have to clear as of right now, the $70 million that you're over the cap, you probably need to clear about $100 million just to be able to fit in any, like you mentioned, the free agents, the 6, 7, 8, however many draft picks they make.
There is a strong chance when you listen or watch this, depending on the day you watch this is obviously our Thursday pod, but another player could have been added to that mix. I would look for a headline of a Saints player getting restructured almost every day between now and the start of the league year, which I believe is March 13th, which is when they would have to get cap compliant, which, do the math, what is it, February 22nd? Is that right now? So we're talking about, what, a little over 3
February,
weeks?
the short month, so
yeah, a little over 3 weeks, so that's 21 days, and I just said they're probably going to be at least 8 or 9 or 9 or 10, so be on the lookout for another name to pop up. Again, Granderson, Ruiz, Derek Carr, all those names, all those possible restructures could be coming soon. Anything else to add for today?
I'm good.
He's good. He's well dressed. He's got a Pelicans game to go to tonight. All right. Good for you. All right. That'll do it for us today. Thank you for watching Fox 8 Overtime. We'll see you guys next time on Overtime.